A dying veteran asked that the floor in his bedroom not be touched. His family kept their promise for 55 years. But when his grandson finally removed the floorboard, what he found changed everything. Subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments. The wind howled outside the cabin, snow dancing in frenzied spirals beyond the frost-bitten window panes. It was the kind of cold that clung to your bones, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a wool blanket soaked in memory and regret. Inside the bedroom, the air felt thick and motionless, as though time had decided to stand still out of respect for the man lying in the bed. The walls creaked occasionally, not from movement, but from age, decades of winters and storms embedded into the wood like ghosts whispering through the grain. Edgar Hartman lay still beneath a heavy woolen blanket, his breath shallow, ragged, barely audible. His face was worn like an old map, each wrinkle carved by time, war, and the weight of a life lived in solitude. His once powerful frame, built in the rice paddies of Vietnam and hardened by Alaska's unforgiving landscape, had withered. Only his eyes retained their strength, sharp, demanding, holding on to something that even death had yet to loosen. Henry, his only son, sat quietly in the armchair by the bed. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and tired-looking, his hair already thinning at the temples. His hands, calloused from labor on the land, rested on his knees, clenched together in anxious silence. It had been 2 days since Edgar last spoke, 2 days since any of them thought he would again. But now, in the dim golden light of the oil lamp, Edgar's lips moved. Henry leaned in. "Promise me," Edgar rasped, the words coming out as a whisper. "Promise me you'll never touch the floor." Henry blinked, confused. "What?" "The floor," Edgar repeated with surprising clarity. "In this room. Never remove it, never replace it. Don't let anyone tear it up, not for 50 years. Henry stared at his father. The floor? Of all the things, why the floor? He glanced down at it. The boards were old, pine perhaps, dulled by time and scuffed from decades of boots and furniture dragging across them. There was nothing special about it, nothing strange or sacred, just a floor. "Why?" he asked, hesitating, but Edgar only shook his head, slowly, weakly, as if the question itself missed the point. "Swear it," he breathed, "no matter what." There was something in Edgar's expression that sent a chill down Henry's spine, something beyond the frailty, beyond the pain. There was a fire still alive in those sunken eyes. Not fear exactly, not guilt, but something unspoken and immovable. "I promise," Henry said finally. He didn't know why he said it. He didn't understand the reason behind the request, but in that moment, looking at the man who had raised him in near silence, who had taught him to respect the land and fear nothing except dishonor, he knew this was not a promise to be made lightly. Edgar closed his eyes again, and this time he didn't open them. That night, the storm outside reached its peak. The wind rattled the windows with such force that Henry thought they might shatter. But inside the room, there was an eerie calm, like the house itself understood what had just happened. The air carried the weight of finality, the weight of something else too, something buried, perhaps, though not yet revealed. The next morning, Henry found himself standing in the center of the room, staring down at the floor his father had spoken of. He knelt and touched one of the boards gently, pressing his palm flat against it. The wood was cold, unyielding, nothing stirred beneath, nothing made a sound. Yet his father's words echoed in his head with quiet persistence. 50 years. He whispered it to himself, as if trying to convince the room that he understood. But he didn't. Not really. At the funeral, neighbors from the nearby village came to pay their respects. Most had known Edgar only from a distance. He was a man who kept to himself, speaking little, rarely smiling, his reputation rooted in discipline and survival. Some whispered about his service overseas, others mentioned his refusal to attend church or his obsessive record-keeping. None of them mentioned the war directly, but the silence around it was palpable. After the service, someone asked Henry if he would finally renovate the old place, modernize it a little, they said, get rid of that drafty floor. He smiled politely, shook his head, and changed the subject. The floor would stay. The years that followed were quiet and hard. Henry inherited the house, the land, and the weight of his father's silence. He tried to keep things in order, repaired the roof, fixed the chimney, patched the siding, but the bedroom remained untouched, just as Edgar had left it. Dust settled thickly on the dresser. The curtains yellowed with age, and the floor continued to creak with every shifting of the seasons. Not once did Henry allow anyone to enter it without supervision. The room became something sacred, not out of sentimentality, but out of obligation. His wife, Margaret, found the whole thing unsettling. In their early years, she suggested they convert the room into something practical, a nursery perhaps, or a study. Henry refused. When she pressed the issue, he grew angry in a way she rarely saw. After that, she let it go. Over time, she too began to feel the weight of the promise, though she had never made it herself. Their son, Daniel, was born in that house. He grew up playing in the snowy fields behind the barn, learning to fish in the nearby creek, and climbing the broken fence that bordered the property. From an early age, he knew not to ask about the locked room at the end of the hallway. It was part of the house's rhythm, a door that never opened, a floor that never changed. One winter afternoon, when Daniel was 6, he snuck into the room while his parents were outside chopping firewood. Henry found him sitting on the bed, legs swinging above the floor, humming a song to himself. The moment their eyes met, Daniel stopped. He looked up, confused, as his father crossed the room in 3 long strides and lifted him into his arms. "Out," Henry said, and carried him back into the hallway. He didn't yell. He didn't punish the boy, but he didn't explain either. That night, he nailed the door shut from the inside. Years passed. Daniel left for college, then returned with a degree in business and a fiancée from Anchorage. They moved into a rental nearby while Henry remained in the house alone. He was older now, grayer, slower. The land was harder to maintain, the winters crueler. But he never left. He never stopped visiting that room. Sometimes Margaret would catch him standing in the doorway, hand on the frame, staring at the floor in silence. By then, she no longer asked questions. In the early months of 2023, Henry fell ill. It came on fast, something in the lungs, the doctors said, aggressive and unforgiving. Within weeks, he was bedridden. Margaret called Daniel, who arrived with his own teenage son, Luke. Henry knew the end was near. He didn't ask for much. Only one thing. "Don't touch the floor," he told Daniel the night before he slipped into unconsciousness, "no matter what you think, no matter what anyone says. 55 years, not one less." "Dad," Daniel began, confused, "what are you—" "Just promise me." He didn't say why the years had increased from 50 to 55. He didn't need to. Daniel looked into his father's eyes and saw something he hadn't seen since he was a boy. A flicker of that same intensity that had once lived in Edgar. He promised. Henry died the next morning, with his hand resting on the edge of the bed and his face turned toward the floor. They buried him next to Edgar beneath the pine tree at the edge of the property. It was a quiet funeral with only close friends and family. No speeches, no sermons, just snow, wind, and the sound of boots crunching over frozen ground. Afterward, Daniel stood in the old bedroom, now his by inheritance. The boards beneath his feet groaned softly as he shifted his weight. Dust swirled in the fading light, and the cold crept in from the corners. He remembered every moment he'd spent avoiding this room, every question he never asked, every silence he inherited from his father and grandfather alike. Luke appeared in the doorway behind him. "Why did Grandpa never change this room?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I promised him I wouldn't." He looked down at the floor, weathered and worn, as if it had been waiting, as if it remembered. And somewhere, deep beneath the boards, something else waited too, something that would outlive the silence. The years that followed Henry's death passed like falling snow, quiet, slow, barely noticed until everything beneath was covered. The house remained, rooted stubbornly in the cold Alaskan soil, surrounded by hills that seemed to draw tighter each year, as if nature itself was pulling the land back into its arms. Daniel became the official owner of the property, though the title felt less like an inheritance and more like a burden carried forward by time. The funeral had left him drained, not just by the logistics or the grief, but by the weight of everything unspoken. His father had been a man of few words and fewer explanations. Daniel had lived most of his life respecting those silences, sometimes admiring them, sometimes resenting them, but rarely questioning them. Now, with both Henry and Edgar gone, he found himself the custodian of something he didn't understand, a legacy not built on money or land, but on avoidance, on a floor that could not be touched. Daniel didn't move into the house right away. He had his own place closer to Anchorage, a stable job in logistics, a wife who preferred suburbia to soil, and a teenage son who was more interested in computer screens than wooden floorboards. But the old farmhouse couldn't be ignored forever. The heating system was on the verge of collapse. The roof leaked in at least 3 places, and the foundation near the back wall had begun to sink. Every week, a new problem announced itself in groans and drafts and shifting shadows. Still, whenever Daniel stepped into the bedroom, the one with the floor, he hesitated. Something about the way the air changed inside that room, the way it grew heavier, colder, more alert, made him uneasy. He would find himself holding his breath without realizing it, stepping only along certain boards as if instinctively avoiding something, though he couldn't say what. The room was not locked. It never had been since Henry removed the nails years ago, but no one used it. No furniture had been moved in or out. The bed remained low and plain, with its original metal frame. The dresser against the far wall stood dusty, its drawers filled with forgotten flannel shirts and brittle paper. The floor, once a living map of Edgar's footsteps, now seemed untouched by time, though it sagged more in the middle and creaked louder than before. Daniel's wife, Sarah, visited once. She spent less than 5 minutes in the bedroom before stepping out and saying, "There's something wrong with that room." When he asked her what she meant, she just shook her head. Their son, Luke, was different. He was curious, always had been. Where Daniel had learned to suppress his questions, Luke was born in a generation that demanded answers. He roamed the house freely during their visits, snapping photos of the rotten eaves and making comments about how the place could be cool if fixed up. He liked the barn, even climbed into the hayloft once, before realizing there was nothing there but nesting birds and dust. One day, as Daniel stood in the kitchen checking a leaky faucet, Luke wandered into the bedroom again. This time he stayed longer. When Daniel found him, the boy was kneeling on the floor, tracing the edge of a floorboard with his fingers. "Don't do that," Daniel said, sharper than he intended. Luke looked up, startled. "Sorry," he said. "I wasn't trying to pull anything up. It's just some of the boards feel weird." Daniel didn't reply. Instead, he gestured for Luke to leave the room and close the door behind them. The floor did feel different. He knew that, had always known it, even if he couldn't explain how or why. He remembered being a child, hearing his mother argue with his father about the room. She wanted to turn it into a nursery when she was pregnant, said it was the only space in the house with enough light. But Henry had refused. His voice, calm but unwavering, cut through the house like a blade. "We made a promise," he said. And that was the end of the conversation. Now, Daniel was the one holding the promise, and, unlike his father, he had no idea what it meant. The town nearby had changed since Daniel was a boy. The general store was gone, replaced by a gas station with overpriced coffee and spotty Wi-Fi. Most of the farmers had retired or moved south. The younger generation wasn't interested in working the land anymore. They sold their acres to developers or let them go fallow. But the Hartman property had remained intact, untouched. Some of the neighbors called it the Ghost Farm. Daniel didn't like the name, but he couldn't deny the truth behind it. The house felt like it belonged to another time, maybe even another world. Its corners were filled with dust and memories. Its walls still remembered voices that were long gone, and in that bedroom, beneath that floor, something waited. Not a ghost, not a body, something quieter, denser. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Daniel returned alone to the house to make a list of all the repairs it would need before the spring thaw. The kitchen cabinets were warped. The windows in the living room didn't seal properly. The stairs creaked ominously, and the foundation needed urgent attention. He took notes, measured lengths of wood, ran his fingers along cold walls, but every time he passed that bedroom door, he paused. He hadn't opened it in weeks. Finally, just before leaving, he stepped inside and stood there, listening. The floor didn't creak. That was new. He walked to the center of the room and stood perfectly still. His weight shifted slightly. The boards held. Then he stepped left. A soft groan. Right. Silence. He moved again. This time a faint knock, like something loose beneath the wood. He bent down, pressed his palm to the floor just as his father had done all those years ago. It was warmer than he expected. Back in town, he told Sarah what he'd felt. She suggested getting someone to inspect the foundation, just to be safe. He agreed. But when the contractor came and asked permission to access the crawl space beneath the bedroom, Daniel said no. "I'll do it myself," he told the man, offering a tip for the inconvenience. That night, he dreamt of the floor, not the house, not his father or grandfather, just the floor. Endless wooden boards stretching in every direction, groaning under his feet as he walked. He woke up with the sensation still in his chest, as though he'd been standing on it the whole time. Days passed. Luke began asking more questions. Why the floor was important. Why the room was off limits. Why they didn't just pull it up and see what was underneath. "Because it's not time," Daniel answered. Time for what? He didn't know. On the anniversary of Henry's death, Daniel returned to the house again, this time with Luke. They cleared out the hallway, swept dust from the stairs, and opened the bedroom door together. Luke stepped inside first. "Still smells the same," he said. Daniel nodded. He walked over to the window, cracked it open. The cold came rushing in. It stirred the dust, carried it in lazy spirals through the fading sunlight. They stood in silence. "I think he was hiding something," Luke said. Daniel looked at him, not with anger, not with dismissal, but with something like recognition. The same look his father once gave him. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe it's not about hiding. Maybe it's about waiting." Luke knelt again, pressing his hand to the same board he had weeks before. "It's loose," he said. "I know." They didn't touch it, not yet. Daniel looked around the room, then at his son, the boy who would inherit the silence next. 55 years, his father had said, not one less. It had only been 54. So they stood together in the room beneath the weight of a promise older than both of them, while the house whispered its secrets through the boards and the snow fell quietly outside. Spring arrived late that year, reluctant and uneven. The snow held onto the earth longer than usual, clinging to the roots of old trees and the edges of rusted fence posts, as if resisting the inevitable. But even in the frozen north, winter could not last forever. By late April, patches of brown grass began to appear along the base of the barn, and the ice in the creek behind the house finally cracked and surrendered to the slow, cold trickle of thaw. Daniel found himself returning to the farmhouse more often, always alone. The repair list had grown, not just with practical concerns like the rotting porch steps or the sagging roof over the pantry, but with abstract questions that filled his thoughts when he wandered from room to room. He had inherited more than just a building. He had inherited a structure made of restraint and riddles. The bedroom with the floor had taken on a presence all its own, a quiet authority that both repelled and drew him in. Each time he passed it, he felt the question pressing harder. Sarah no longer asked why he went out there. She had accepted that the house and everything attached to it belonged to a part of Daniel that she would never fully access. Luke, on the other hand, asked often. He wanted to go back. He wanted to explore the barn again, to record the strange acoustics in the bedroom, to ask more questions. But Daniel, despite his own restless need to understand, kept him away. Then came the day Daniel couldn't avoid any longer. The call came from the plumbing contractor he had hired for preliminary assessments. They had found black mold in the basement. A full overhaul was needed before any real renovation could take place. When the contractor asked about access beneath the master bedroom to replace support beams, Daniel's chest tightened. He asked for time. The man didn't understand, but he agreed. That night, Daniel sat at the dining table of the farmhouse, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos, staring at the open notebook before him. The floor plan of the house, hand-drawn by Henry decades ago, showed each room, each measurement, each note about the structure. But the space beneath the master bedroom was blank. Every other area had notes, beam lengths, crawlspace vents, old piping, but not that one. He thought back to Edgar, whom he barely remembered, and to Henry, who had spent his life tending to this house like a living thing, refusing to let time or logic or even decay interfere with the strange terms of a promise. Daniel had kept the vow as long as he could, but now the house itself was demanding a decision. He couldn't sell it in this condition. He couldn't fix it without tearing into that room. And he couldn't tear into it, not yet. Not until the time was right. Back in his own home, Luke noticed the shift. His father was quieter than usual, slower to respond, his thoughts always elsewhere. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the late sun stretch across the lawn, Luke asked the question again. Why did Grandpa say 55 years? Daniel didn't answer right away. He rubbed his hands together as if trying to warm up fingers that had not touched the cold in hours. I don't know, he said finally, but he was exact about it. Luke frowned. You think there's something buried under there? Daniel exhaled through his nose. I think there's something more than wood, he said, and I think your grandfather believed that time mattered, that it had to wait. Luke didn't ask why. He had grown used to his father's half-answers, the long pauses, and the thoughts never spoken aloud. But that night, he retrieved a small handheld tape recorder from his backpack and placed it on the bedside table in his room. He wanted to capture something, anything, from that house, even if it was only silence. On his next visit to the farmhouse, Daniel brought tools. Not to tear up the floor, not yet, but to reinforce the crumbling parts of the porch and fix the door that no longer latched. Every swing of the hammer reminded him of his father. Henry had built most of the furniture himself. He had repaired everything he could with his own hands. Daniel had never inherited that skill. He was a man of measurements and plans, of supply chains and logistics, not of nails and sawdust. But there, in that quiet house, he tried. When he took a break, he wandered into the bedroom again. The floor seemed almost to hum beneath him, a kind of tension in the boards that couldn't be heard but could be felt. He crouched near the center of the room and ran his fingers along the grain of the wood. Some of the boards felt newer, as if they had been replaced once, but not by him. He wondered if Henry had repaired small sections without disturbing the whole, working around the edges to preserve the integrity of whatever had been hidden. He stood slowly and turned to leave, but something on the windowsill caught his eye. It was a small, thin crack in the wood, just wide enough to slip a coin into. He peered closer and saw, just barely, the remnants of an old thread, frayed, almost invisible. A tripwire? A marker? He didn't touch it, but it added to the feeling that the room was more than wood and walls. Later that week, Luke came to him with an old photo he had found in one of Henry's trunks. It was a black and white image, faded and scratched. It showed a much younger Edgar in military fatigues, standing with a group of other soldiers in front of what appeared to be a jungle outpost. The photo had a note on the back in Henry's handwriting, Vietnam, 1966, Company B. Luke had looked up the unit. There were no records of it in the public archives. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. He thought of his father's refusal to talk about the past, of the few times he had asked, only to be met with cold silence, of the arguments between his parents that always ended with his mother saying, "He never came back from that war." Luke placed the photo on the table beside the notebook where Daniel had been recording repair cost. The two items sat side by side, one a record of decay, the other a trace of history. "Maybe the floor has something to do with this," Luke said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe it has everything to do with it." Another week passed. The contractor called again, this time with a firmer tone. The mold had spread. The foundation under the back half of the house was beginning to sag. There was no more time for waiting. If repairs didn't begin soon, the structure would be compromised beyond saving. Daniel drove to the house that evening without telling anyone. The wind had picked up again, stirring the pine trees around the property like an audience waiting for the next act. The bedroom door creaked when he opened it. The floor groaned as he stepped in. He stood at the center of the room and let the silence wrap around him. It had been 54 years and 11 months. He closed his eyes. "Just a little longer," he whispered, Then he left, locking the front door behind him. 2 days later, Luke received a notification from the tape recorder he had hidden in the room during his last visit. A motion-sensitive feature had been triggered. He opened the file, expecting to hear creaking boards or wind through the broken glass, but the recording was almost silent. Almost. There was a sound, barely perceptible, a dull, rhythmic knock, then another, and then a scrape. Luke played it again and again, amplifying the noise, filtering out background hiss. The sound repeated every few seconds. A knock, then a pause, a scrape, then silence. He didn't tell his father right away. Instead, he listened to it at night, over and over, as if trying to decode a language that no longer existed. And, with each repetition, he became more convinced that the sound was not random, that it was deliberate, that it had waited all these years not just to be discovered, but to be heard. And when he finally told Daniel, when he played the recording in the kitchen as the light faded behind the hills, neither of them spoke for a long time, because deep down they both knew. The silence was ending. The morning that Daniel decided to lift the floorboard, the light came early, sharp and pale through the kitchen window of the farmhouse, as if the day itself had grown impatient. He had not slept well. For weeks, his dreams had shifted from vague unease to vivid impressions, visions of thick jungles, wet boots, distant gunfire muffled by heat and trees, faces he didn't know turning away into shadow. In those dreams, he stood alone in the center of the bedroom, the floor stretching out endlessly beneath him, breathing with each creak, alive and waiting. He would wake, soaked in sweat, unsure what he had heard, and with the feeling that someone had been whispering in his ear just before the world returned. That morning, Sarah watched him from across the breakfast table. She said nothing at first. The silence had become customary between them, like an old scar they no longer mentioned. But this morning, something in his face was different. The tension he had carried for months was now sharpened, resolved. "You're going to do it," she said quietly. He looked up and met her eyes. Yes. She didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't offer one. Instead, she reached across the table, touched his hand, and held it for a long moment. Then she got up, refilled his coffee, and kissed his temple before leaving the room. When he arrived at the farmhouse, the air inside was still and cold. Dust hung suspended in the beams of sunlight cutting through the hallway, unmoving, untouched. The boards beneath his boots groaned softly, but even they sounded subdued, as if waiting. He paused in the doorway of the bedroom, the same place he had stood as a boy, as a man, as a father. The air in that room was always cooler, always heavier. It was not superstition. It was simply the way it was. The floor had not changed. It bore the same worn path from the door to the window, the same hairline splits between the boards, the same faded knots in the grain that formed unintentional patterns. But now, after so many years, Daniel noticed something new. One board, just off-center, had a slightly different tone to its grain, a subtler finish, less faded than its neighbors. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing the edge. It responded with a gentle creak, softer than the others, almost like an exhale. He stood and retrieved the tools he had brought, a crowbar, a flashlight, a pair of gloves. He didn't hesitate. If he did, he might never follow through. The promise had been honored. The time had passed. And now the weight of generations pressed down not to stop him, but to see it done. The crowbar slid between the boards with effort. The wood resisted at first, stiff with age and secrecy. Then, with a sharp pop, the board lifted. Dust flew upward, dancing briefly before settling again. Beneath it, darkness. Daniel pulled the board away fully and set it aside, revealing a narrow hollow space beneath the floor. The cavity was shallow, maybe a foot deep, and carefully lined with old canvas. He leaned in, holding the flashlight at an angle, and felt his breath catch in his throat. Inside the hollow were 3 small burlap sacks, aged and weather-stained, neatly arranged. Each bore a faded symbol on its surface, unfamiliar, possibly a military marking or an old storage code. Beside them, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a thick envelope yellowed with time. Daniel reached in and lifted one of the sacks. It was heavy. The weight was unmistakable. He loosened the string at its neck, and the mouth of the bag opened. Gold coins spilled into his gloved palm, warm from his touch, glinting in the beam of the flashlight. Old, real, and many. He stared at them, his mind momentarily blank. This wasn't just money. It was intent. It was a decision made long ago, with calculation and purpose. Someone had hidden these, not out of fear, but as part of something larger. He opened the second bag. More coins. The third, smaller but filled as well. And then the envelope. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, Daniel unfolded the brittle paper and began to read. The letter was addressed simply, "To the one who waits." It began with a date, November the 17th, 1968, and then a confession. Edgar's handwriting was stiff and narrow, the letters shaped by control and discipline. He did not waste words. He began by explaining his role in an operation during the Vietnam War. The name of the village was one Daniel did not recognize, though he knew immediately what the letter meant by it. The operation had been classified. He and his unit had been ordered into the area with vague instructions and broader permissions. Intelligence suggested enemy activity. What followed, Edgar wrote, had haunted him every day since. There had been no enemy, no fire, only civilians. They had been told not to question, only to contain. He had obeyed the order. They all had. The letter did not describe the aftermath in detail. Edgar had no need to. The silence between his words was louder than any recounting. But what became clear was that Edgar had never forgiven himself. He had returned home carrying more than scars. He carried shame. And more than that, a desperate need to make amends, even if no one else would know. Daniel continued to read. Edgar had taken his military pension, the farm's early profits, and begun slowly converting portions into gold. He avoided banks, distrusted markets. He studied economics, inflation, depreciation. He believed that in 50 years, paper would be dust, but gold would remain. The idea wasn't just to preserve money. It was to preserve value across time. Not for himself, for the future. For the land he had worked, the house he had built, the family he could not explain himself to. He had calculated by hand the value of compounded inflation. He had tracked currencies, political instability, tax shelters. Everything pointed to one thing, that in 5 decades what he left behind would be worth more than anyone could imagine. But it had to wait. Time was part of the plan. The 55-year silence was not superstition, it was strategy, economics, redemption. He wanted his descendants to have a foundation when they needed it most, not when they were tempted, not when they were curious, but when the land cried out and they had no other choice. Daniel lowered the letter into his lap. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the staggering weight of what he had just absorbed. His grandfather had been no mystic, no madman whispering about floorboards. He had been precise, purposeful. The floor was a vault, not for gold, but for an idea. He called Luke. The boy arrived breathless, his eyes wide. When Daniel handed him the coin and the letter, Luke said nothing at first. He read the paper slowly, mouthing some of the words under his breath. When he looked up, his face had changed. "That's why he made the promise," Luke said. Daniel nodded. The two of them worked into the evening, uncovering the rest of the space beneath the floor. They found another envelope, this one containing coordinates, access codes, and a list of banking institutions in Switzerland and Singapore. Trusts, funds, an entire architecture of deferred wealth, arranged with methodical care. By the time the sun had set, the room looked different, not because the boards had been moved, but because the silence had changed. It no longer pressed inward. It exhaled, finally freed. Daniel called the lawyer the next morning. It would take weeks, perhaps months, to navigate the legal channels, verify the accounts, process the documents. But every step felt like a part of something long overdue. He visited his father's grave that weekend, brought nothing, said little, only stood in the wind and whispered, "I waited." He did not know if anyone heard, but he believed that something, somewhere, did. That night, Daniel and Luke sat in the bedroom surrounded by open floorboards, old papers, and gold. Neither of them asked what would come next. They already knew. The waiting was over. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of silence, one not heavy with suspicion or mystery, but dense with motionless awe. The farmhouse, once a place of creaking bones and whispered doubts, now felt suspended between memory and revelation. Daniel walked its halls like a man newly awakened, retracing old paths with different eyes that now saw patterns in the choices of the men who came before him. The letter from Edgar had left them both stunned, not by its confession alone, but by the magnitude of thought that lay behind every line. It wasn't only guilt, it wasn't madness. It was something colder, more rational, a lifelong calculation not just of money, but of time, legacy, and forgiveness. And within that letter was something more, an intricate code, references to seemingly arbitrary pages of newspapers, obscure mentions of books long out of print, and a scattered series of numbers. Daniel had shown the documents to a financial advisor, a reserved woman named Grace who had seen her share of eccentric trusts and multi-generational wealth puzzles. But even she admitted this was unusual. The documents were real. The signatures matched official registries. There were accounts indeed, long dormant, never touched, yet still growing slowly in value through bonds, foreign investments, and holdings in precious metals. But access to the largest vault, mentioned in a separate envelope, was protected by a cipher. It was Luke who recognized the structure. In his bedroom at home, surrounded by printouts and notes, he pored over the combinations, discovering patterns that mimicked cipher wheels and frequency matrices. The key, he believed, lay not just in numbers, but in words. The phrasing of the letter itself, the rhythm of how Edgar had written, the places he paused, the words he repeated. They spent hours decoding the text, every symbol and reference drawing them deeper into the strange mind of the man they had known only in fragments. They learned about the jungle outpost Edgar had referenced, the company he'd served with, and, more disturbingly, the classified reports he had somehow smuggled back. These weren't documents for public sympathy. They weren't emotional apologies or confessions meant to absolve. They were records, timelines, accounts of events in cold, unfiltered prose. It became clear that Edgar hadn't only carried the memory of a crime, he had carried the burden of witness. Daniel found himself shaken. He couldn't reconcile the image of the quiet farmer, hands deep in soil, boots cracked with use, with the man who had written these things, who had kept secrets buried deeper than the floorboards. Yet, in another way, it made sense. The emotional distance, the constant gaze through windows rather than at people, the fierce insistence on silence, these were not quirks. They were scars with their own language. The cipher, once broken, led them to a password. Not just for the financial institutions, but for a secure archive on a drive buried inside a false wall in the attic, behind a row of unused boards. Luke found it by accident, investigating loose beams, guided by yet another cryptic note Edgar had tucked behind a molding. The stars are older than paper. What that meant, they never fully figured out. But the drive was real, and its contents were staggering. Dozens of audio files, recordings made over the years, some clearly from Edgar's voice, others from radios, conversations, even confessionals, some in languages Daniel could not identify. Then there were images. Old, scanned photos of destroyed villages, black and white shots with timestamps, rows of civilians standing in front of soldiers, the edges burned or blurred. There were journal entries, digital copies of handwritten logs, and letters that had never been mailed. Daniel sat with the laptop in his lap, scrolling for hours, trying to absorb the depth of what his grandfather had done. Some might have called it obsessive. Some might have called it paranoid. But to Daniel, it began to feel like a war memorial without a country. A man who had built a monument to his own inability to forget, not with stone or names, but with strategy and math. And now it had fallen into their hands. Yet, alongside all of it was a separate instruction, a handwritten note Edgar had left among the final pages of his code. When the house begins to die, open the floor. When the code is solved, don't hoard what was meant to heal. A home is only whole when its rot is cut away. Daniel read it again and again. He stood in the center of the bedroom that night, surrounded by lifted boards, the burlap sacks now empty, their contents secured, the old letters spread on the floor like scripture. He thought of the cracked windows, the sagging walls, the porch that leaned more each day. The house had indeed begun to die. And Edgar's meaning was now painfully clear. The money wasn't just for the family. It was for the house. And not just the wood and nails of it, but the idea of it. The house as a place that could be made new, redeemed, purified. And whatever was left, it was meant to go beyond them. He called Luke to the room. "Your great-grandfather didn't want this to sit in a vault," Daniel said. "He wanted it to move forward, to fix things." Luke nodded slowly. "The village?" Daniel looked at the files again, at the names Edgar had written in the margins, the brief mention of orphanages, the children who had survived, who had been displaced, scattered across countries with no records. "They may not even be alive," he said. "But some might be," Luke said, "or their families." Daniel sat heavily on the edge of the stripped bed frame. "He left everything to us," he said, "but not for us." They spent the next weeks in motion. Meetings with lawyers, translators, financial institutions. Grace introduced them to a nonprofit with experience in tracing war refugees. A quiet woman from Laos took particular interest. She recognized one of the village names. She knew the landscape. She told them that near the border there was still a scar of black earth where no crops grew, a place the locals refused to speak of. Daniel didn't ask how she knew, he just listened. With her help and the resources Edgar had left behind, they began to build something. A trust named not for the family, but for the village. The old Hartman land was partially signed over to a new preservation initiative designed to support displaced communities, veterans in crisis, and cross-cultural reconciliation projects. It was more than Daniel ever thought he'd be part of. It was more than Edgar had likely dared to imagine would happen. Still, the work was not without tension. Sarah, though supportive, struggled with the idea of giving away what had finally come to them after so long. Others in the extended family voiced disapproval. They called it madness, a betrayal of inheritance, a mistake. Daniel didn't fight them. He only returned to the letter, to the code, to the sound of Edgar's voice on those old tapes, and each time it anchored him. Luke, for his part, became obsessed with the recordings. He began editing them, adding captions, trying to catalog what he called a map of someone's guilt. He shared some of the tapes anonymously with veterans forums. One in particular, a recording of Edgar speaking to a friend in his final years, caught attention. In it, Edgar said, "I don't want forgiveness. I just want to make sure someone else doesn't have to carry what I carried. Let the silence die with me. Let the house speak instead." The post went viral. Emails came in from around the world. Some from people who remembered Edgar vaguely, others from families of soldiers who had served in similar operations. One message came from a man who believed his father had been in the same unit. He included a photograph. 5 men stand in waist-high water, rifles slung, smiles thin and forced. Edgar was in the middle. Daniel stared at it for a long time. The past, it seemed, was not finished unraveling. Still, the work continued. Contractors arrived at the farmhouse. Beams were replaced. The roof was rebuilt. The porch straightened. Yet the bedroom remained untouched, its floor reassembled with care, each board nailed down in the exact position it had rested before, not as a shrine, but as a reminder. The floor had been a seal, a lock, a container of silence. Now it was a threshold. On the day the final check cleared for the foundation Edgar had envisioned, Daniel took Luke back to the room. The sun streamed in, casting light on the wood. No dust, no creak. Daniel looked at his son. "What do we call it?" he asked. Luke smiled faintly. "Let's call it what it is," he said, "redemption." The wind over the hills moved softer now, no longer shrieking like it did that first winter after Henry's death, but whispering through the pine needles like a voice speaking from memory. The house stood different, and yet the same. Its walls had been straightened, its bones reinforced. The new roof no longer groaned with every gust of cold air, and the pipes no longer banged like hollow drums in the night. But none of that change altered the soul of the place. It remained a house that had held decades of silence, and it would always carry the weight of what had been buried beneath its floor. The restoration had taken longer than expected. Months had turned to a year, delays layered with permits and old beams that needed custom milling. But Daniel didn't complain. He had long since come to see time the way his grandfather had, not as an obstacle, but as an ally when used with care. While contractors rebuilt the porch and the outer wall near the foundation, he spent hours in the back office, writing letters to organizations, coordinating the trust, and handling the final details of what had become Edgar Hartman's posthumous mission. And he wasn't alone. Luke had become, in many ways, the quiet steward of the project. He handled the digital archive of documents with a precision that bordered on reverence, cataloging photos, converting old reel-to-reel tapes into clean audio, translating excerpts of Edgar's letters and field reports with the help of volunteers. What had started as a simple curiosity had evolved into something deeper for the boy, a kind of intimate relationship with a man he had never known, built through words never spoken aloud. Daniel watched his son and recognized in him something familiar. Not just the curiosity or the intelligence, but the sense of burden. It was not the crushing kind, but the kind that made a person stand taller. There was a stillness in Luke's eyes now that hadn't been there before, and a quiet force behind the things he said. One evening, Daniel found him sitting in the bedroom, just looking at the floor. The light was low, and Luke wasn't recording anything or writing in a notebook. He was simply sitting, as though paying respect to something ancient and breathing. Daniel didn't interrupt. The trust, once established, became something more than a vehicle for distributing money. It grew into a platform for reconciliation. The organization that had helped them locate the village survivors began using the story to build international partnerships. A new initiative launched, small grants to support children of displaced communities, war orphans now grown, many of whom had lived their whole lives unaware of the specific conflict that had shaped them. The Hartman Fund, as it came to be called, began offering scholarships under names taken directly from Edgar's notes, names of villagers he had written down with trembling hands. Not everyone understood. Some members of the extended family still wrote angry emails, accusing Daniel of tarnishing their name or giving away wealth that could have bought land, stocks, vacation homes. Others tried to argue Edgar's guilt was exaggerated, that soldiers followed orders, that the past should be left where it was. Daniel did not answer those messages. He knew they came from people who had only seen the floor, but never touched what lay beneath it. What mattered were the letters that came from others, from survivors, from their children, from young veterans who had found the recordings online and heard something in Edgar's voice that made them feel less alone. A letter arrived from a woman in Laos whose grandmother had once lived in the village Edgar referenced. She wrote not in anger, but in gratitude. She said she did not need to forgive him, but she was thankful someone, somewhere, had remembered. Daniel pinned that letter to the newly painted wall of the farmhouse study. He was not immune to doubt. There were nights when he sat at the kitchen table, long after Sarah and Luke had gone to bed, wondering whether he had done the right thing, whether the house could ever really be clean again, no matter how many boards were replaced or charities were funded, whether a man's past could truly be redeemed by what he left behind. But each time those thoughts came, he would find his way to the bedroom and sit there in the dark. And each time the silence would answer with a kind of gentle affirmation. The final restoration of the bedroom was completed on the 56th anniversary of Edgar's death. Not by design. It simply worked out that way. The last board, the one that had been lifted first, was returned to its place. It had been sanded, sealed, and reinforced, but its surface still bore the faint knot pattern that Daniel had traced as a boy, the one that once seemed to form the outline of a tree. Luke stood beside him as the workers cleared their tools and left them alone in the room. "No more secrets," Daniel said, almost to himself. Luke looked around, his voice soft. No more silence. They had decided not to turn the room into anything else. It would remain a bedroom, as it always had been, but with nothing stored beneath, no locked drawers, no heavy shadows. Just a bed, a dresser, a small table with a lamp, and a single photo frame on the wall, the image of Edgar standing in the jungle, his eyes fixed on something beyond the camera, beyond time. That evening, they invited Grace and a few others who had helped build the trust to a quiet gathering at the farmhouse. There was no ceremony, no press, just stories shared over coffee and the sound of the wind slipping through pine needles outside. Grace spoke briefly, her words simple but clear, about how rare it was for a legacy to be so carefully handed down, not in money or power, but in intention. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Daniel sat by the fire with Sarah. She looked at him with tired but warm eyes. "You did what he couldn't," she said. "I think he did it," Daniel replied. "He just needed us to finish it." Outside, the moonlight draped the hills in silver. The trees stood motionless, as if listening. A few days later, Daniel returned to the nursing home where Henry had spent his final months. He had never gone back after his father's death, not out of avoidance, but because the place had always felt like the last chapter of a book too painful to reread. But now, he carried something different with him. A copy of the Trust's founding charter, a letter written in his own hand, and an envelope containing a small symbolic check made in Henry's name. He handed the items to the director, a kind man with fading hair and bright eyes, and explained why he had come. The man listened patiently, then placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said, "It sounds like your father believed in something deeper than himself." Daniel smiled, though his eyes stung. "He did," he said, "even when none of us could see it." The farmhouse, now fully restored, became a kind of retreat. Not public, not open to tours or visitors, but available to those who needed a place to think, to write, to sit with the quiet. Veterans came sometimes, quietly, without announcement. So did aid workers and descendants of families displaced by conflicts halfway across the world. They left behind nothing but their names in a guest book and the occasional note of thanks. Daniel read every one, and each time he remembered the first creak of that board, the feel of the cold beneath it, the silence that had once held a secret, and the voice of a man long gone who had trusted that silence would end when it was finally time to speak. The house no longer whispered, it breathed, and in that breath the legacy lived. The morning was quiet, wrapped in the kind of early mist that softened every edge of the world. Pines stood still like witnesses in formation, their trunks dark against the silver light. The farmhouse rested without protest, no longer groaning under the weight of age or memory, no longer whispering from the walls. It stood restored, not just in timber and glass, but in purpose and spirit. Yet inside, something still pulsed beneath the surface, something that had always been there and, perhaps, always would be. Luke arrived before sunrise. He had driven alone without telling anyone. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he pulled up beside the house and parked just out of habit in the spot his father always used. He stepped out, pulled his backpack over his shoulder, and stood still for a moment, inhaling the cold air. The kind of air that makes your breath visible and your thoughts feel tangible. He was 20 now, older than his father had been when he first stood in the doorway of the forbidden room. His face had changed, more angular, the boyishness in retreat, but there was still that glimmer in his eyes, thoughtful, patient, always slightly ahead of the moment. He had taken a leave of absence from university, not because he was lost, but because he had found something more important to finish. Inside, the house greeted him with stillness. The hardwood floors gleamed, the new windows let in soft, diffused light, and the air smelled of cedar and soap. But the real pull was down the hall to the room at the end, the one that had started everything. The one that had once been sealed in time like a mausoleum. The one that now served no function but remembrance. He pushed open the door slowly, even though the hinges no longer creaked. The room was empty save for the bed, the small table, and the framed photograph on the wall. There were no decorations, no ornaments, nothing to distract from what had once been hidden here. The floor, the original planks reassembled with care and precision, looked as it had before they were lifted, aged, smooth, bearing the quiet dignity of something that had carried generations. Luke set his backpack on the floor beside the window and sat cross-legged in the center of the room. He laid out a small voice recorder, a bound journal, and an old pair of headphones. He didn't speak at first. He just sat, as he had done so many times before, and listened. Not for creaks, not for knocks, or the shift of secret weight beneath him. He listened to the quiet, to the space itself, as if waiting for it to reveal its last, final story. The floor had once been a container, a seal, a vault. But over time, Luke had come to believe it had been more than that. It had been a witness to everything, to a father's guilt, a son's confusion, a grandson's search. And now, to his own reckoning. He clicked on the recorder. "My name is Luke Hartman," he said. "I am speaking from the farmhouse bedroom, the one my great-grandfather asked never to be touched for 55 years. We honored that. And what we found changed everything." He paused. "I've told this story many times now, in interviews, in lectures, and private conversations. But it always felt too neat, too easy to condense something this heavy into a few sentences. So I've come back here, not to explain it, but to try and feel it again. To remind myself that this story didn't begin with gold or war or money. It began with silence." He adjusted the microphone slightly. "My father once said that our family didn't inherit land or wealth. We inherited responsibility. And I didn't understand that until I started reading Edgar's letters, not the ones that explained things, but the ones that never left his desk. The drafts, the ones he wrote late at night, unsure if they would ever be read. In those pages, he wasn't a man planning redemption. He was a man breaking apart slowly, trying to build something that would outlast the ruins." Luke leaned back against the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling. "I think about the night he wrote the final letter. November 17th, 1968. I picture him sitting at that same desk, the war behind him, but not really. Everything inside him fractured, and yet he believed in the floor. Not just as a hiding place, but as a kind of living testament. He trusted that one day we'd find what he left behind, and that we wouldn't use it to escape the past, but to walk straight into it and stay long enough to make sense of it." He was silent for a while, then switched off the recorder. There was nothing more to say just then. Only time and space and wood beneath him that had carried generations of footsteps. He lay down on the floor and closed his eyes. The boards were warm from the morning sun, not in an obvious way, but in the way old things carry warmth from every hand, every boot heel, every memory pressed into their grain. He imagined the years compressed beneath him, his great-grandfather in uniform, his grandfather carrying a hammer through winter mornings, his father on the phone with lawyers speaking words like reconciliation and equity. Luke had done something different. He had returned, again and again. Not to study the floor, but to honor it, to sit with it, to learn its language. He thought of the people who had passed through the house in the last 2 years, the guests from abroad who had written in the ledger, the veterans who had wept quietly in the hallway, the woman who had brought a photo of her father, a boy whose name was scribbled in Edgar's final list. He thought of the ceremony they had held last summer, not a public one, not advertised, just a circle of 20 people beneath the trees. Daniel had spoken, Sarah had lit the candle, and Luke had read the names aloud. Every name from every page Edgar had preserved. No titles, no explanations, just names, one by one. And when he was done, no one clapped. They just stood, hands at their sides, and listened to the wind. That was the only time Luke had seen his father cry in public. Now alone in the house, he sat up and reached into his bag. He pulled out a small wooden box, handcrafted, unadorned. Inside was the final tape they had never shared, the one Edgar had recorded late at night, a month before his death. It was labeled simply, "For Whoever is Last." Luke placed it in the old cassette deck they had restored and pressed play. The tape hissed briefly, then fell quiet. Then Edgar's voice came, slow and worn, but strong. "If you're hearing this, then you've done what I never could. You've outlived it. You've taken the weight and carried it to a better place. I didn't leave gold to buy anything. I left it so you'd have the time. Time to listen, time to think, time to build something I never had the courage to imagine. I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted continuation. And if this room still stands, then you've given it that." There was a pause. "Take care of it. Not the house, the silence. Take care of the silence. Because silence is not the absence of truth, it's where truth waits." Luke let the tape run out. The reel spun until it stopped with a soft click. He left the player where it was, stood slowly, and stretched. He gathered his things, slipped them back into his backpack, and stood in the doorway one last time. The sun had risen fully now, filling the room with gold. He turned off the light and closed the door. Outside, the wind moved through the pines again, no longer whispering, no longer warning, just moving, free. And beneath the floor, nothing stirred, because now, finally, the floor had finished remembering. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, check out our other videos, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.